Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe.
Hi, I'm Rob from roblandphoto.com, and today we're going to be tackling the sticky subject of depth of field. I've had a few questions about this on the podcast and on the blog, and I thought it might be an opportunity to kind of go through some of the basics and also do a bit of a practical exercise that might encourage you to go out and do some playing around with your lenses as well and your settings in your camera to see what you can come up with. So depth of field, what is it and why does it matter? Well, depth of field is probably one of the reasons why you ended up buying one of these if you've got one, a DSLR or an SLR or maybe a bridge camera, because it's the effect. Well, let's take a step backwards. Depth of field is basically how much of a picture is in focus in terms of the view from the camera. So what you can see me now on this video, I'm in focus, and the blinds behind me are in focus as well. Now that means the depth of field of the video camera that we're looking at now probably extends to somewhere like where my hand is, and then all the way through to where those blinds are and further back as well. So it has a large depth of field. So when you take a picture with the little camera that I'm taking this video with, lots of things will be in focus, nice and easy. However, if you're a wedding photographer or a portrait photographer, one of those magical looks, and one of the reasons why we buy expensive cameras, is for photographs that have a small depth of field. So where you'd be able to see me, I would be in focus, nice and sharp, perhaps my eyes, but everything behind would be nice and blurred and soft. Think of those fashion shots, or the classically the wedding photographer shots, where the happy couple or the bride by herself will be in focus. Her eyes will be really sharp, everything else will be nice and soft. Or baby shots, you know, all that sort of stuff. People love short depth of field photos. Sometimes it's worth thinking of it in terms of depth of focus rather than depth of field. So it's one of those techniques, one of those things that it's good to get your head around and kind of understand what you can do with it. There's also a lot of misconceptions about depth of field. And the fact that you need lots of expensive lenses to create very small depth of field, when in fact you don't. So first off, depth of field really, I'm not going to get too technical on this video because it is possible to with depth of field, but basically depth of field is controlled by a number of things, and the simplest ones to think about are your aperture, and your aperture is how big the hole is on your lens that lets the light in, and it's controlled by how far you are away from your subject, and it's also controlled by your focal length of your lens, and also how far away your subject is from the background. Now, a couple of those things they're not really to do with depth of field, but if you want to change the look of the depth of field, these are the things that we play around with. So to start off with, if you want to be playing around with depth of field, your camera, no matter what it is, whether it's a compact or an SLR, what you want to be doing is you want to be setting it to aperture priority, AV on Canon DSLRs, and it might be in the menu settings if you've got a compact. Because what we want to be able to control is the size of the hole on that lens. And basically, as you're sort of clicking through the different sizes, when you look at the screen on the back of your camera, it'll probably start at something like, if you've got a kit lens like this one, start at something like f3.5 and then probably go down to f22. So you think, well, what does that mean? Well, these numbers are f-stops, and the name comes from, in ye olden days with big cameras, to change the hole that let the light in, what you actually had to do was you actually had these discs with holes punched in them that you would drop into the camera. If you've got a Lens Baby Composer or the like, they actually still use things like that to control the aperture. And the aperture really has, the reason why you change the aperture normally is to change your exposure. So as that hole gets bigger, it lets more light in. As it gets smaller, it lets less light in. So on a sunny day, you'd use a small aperture, and on a less sunny day, or if you're inside, you'd be using a large aperture. But it also affects the depth of field of your photograph. Now, one of the ways you can think about it is with these babies. So, with f-stops, okay, the smaller the number, the bigger the hole. So f3.5, although it's a small number, is quite a large hole. f8, although it's a large number, is a smaller hole. So think of it like that. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole. The smaller number, the bigger the hole. And also, the smaller the number, the smaller the depth of field. The bigger the number, the larger the depth of field. So f3.5 will have a smaller depth of field than f8 or f16, which have a larger depth of field. So if we're taking a picture of, say, a portrait of somebody who's standing in front of them, say they're this far away, if we want to blur the background, one of the things we can do is, with our aperture, we could then dial it down to, say, f3.5, and that will help to blur the background. If we wanted lots of it in focus, we would maybe go to f5.6, f8, f11, f16. Just be careful, as your hole gets smaller, you're letting in less light, which means that your shutter speed will get slower or longer, which means that you could get camera shake. Now, another thing before we really start playing around with short depth of field, because that's where all the fun is, let's talk about large depth of field. If you're a landscape photographer or architecture or something like that, you normally want a large depth of field. You want everything in focus, and so your friend for doing that is your wide angle lens. Generally speaking, the wider the angle of lens, the more depth of field it will naturally have or appear to have. So something like this will have a larger depth of field than a telephoto lens. So let's say we were doing a picture where we were on a beach, and we wanted lots of it in focus. We wanted the sand in front of us in focus, and we wanted the setting sun in the distance in focus as well. So what we would do is we would take our camera, we would probably put it on a tripod, because we know we're going to be using a small aperture, something like f16 probably. That means we'll have a longer shutter speed, and we're going to put our camera on a tripod, set it to f16. So where do we focus? Well, where we're going to focus is actually somewhere a third of the way into the scene. And if we use a tight aperture with a wide angle lens, say with our zoom set at like an 18mm, if we focus at a third of the way into the lens, most of the scene will then be in focus all the way out to the infinity, and then up to pretty close to where we are, as long as we're not focused on like a rock like 2 feet away. And so that can be very effective indeed. And to be honest, that's one of the easiest ways of thinking about focusing with depth of field when you want to get everything in focus. We could talk a little bit about hyperfocal distances. In fact, why don't we just address that a little bit? So the hyperfocal distance, what is that? Well, hyperfocal distance of a lens is the point at which, when you focus on something, everything else is in focus all the way to infinity. But with a wide angle lens, when it's set at wide angle like 18mm, it's pretty close to the camera anyway if you're working with smaller apertures. If you've got an older lens, you can actually see it, but don't get too caught up in it. By all means, take a photo, bring up your screen and check on it and see what it's set, and zoom in and check out the focus. But generally speaking, if you're a landscape photographer or an urban photographer or somewhere where you want everything in focus, stick to a tighter aperture, say f8, f11, f16, f22, etc. Focus about a third of the way into the scene, and then everything else will be in focus. There's also another sort of saying that you can use, which news reporters used to use in the olden days when they were saying, what's the setting you should use? And generally speaking, f8 and be there is a good saying. So if your camera is set to f8 and you focus on something, lots of it is going to be in focus anyway, so you don't need to worry about it. So there we go. So that's kind of handling the side of depth of field where everything is in focus. Let's move to the really fun stuff. So let's go back to short depth of field, because this is the stuff that our DSLRs were made to do. Well, not made to do, but are very, very good at it. So as we said, so if we were taking a portrait of someone, like imagine you were taking a picture of me and I was here, what you could do is look at your f-stop and then set it to the smallest number, so that's the biggest hole, and that will give you the shortest depth of field, f3.5. And really, when you're reading through magazines and things, that's what they talk about a lot. You know, use a wide aperture. However, that's not the whole story, and it's not really the thing that affects the image the most. Some of those other things you want to be playing around with, which will change it a lot, is these other things. So the first thing I would say as well is look at your background. See where your background is. If you can get your subject further away from your background, that background is going to be more out of focus. Job done. Nice and easy to do it that way. However, probably the biggest difference you're going to make if you want nice, creamy, blurred backgrounds, even when you're fairly close to some, or you want a photo that's fairly close, like this sort of distance here, is not to use this lens. Don't use your 18-55. You've probably got one already, but get your budget telephoto zoom. This is the 55-250, f5.6 to f8, I think it is, or something. You know, it's not what we would call a fast lens. It doesn't have a wide aperture, but the secret is to set it to something like 100, 135, even sort of 200. Put that on the front of your camera. You're going to have to get further away from your subject to get the same crop, even if you're doing like a headshot or a three-quarter or a full-length shot. But what that will do is that will make your photos look like they've got a very small depth of field. Now, if we go into the technicalities of it, you're not actually changing the depth of field. All that's really happening is that that blurred background is actually appearing to be closer because of the way that the telephoto's lenses, the longer lenses, appear to compress a photo. So that's the biggest thing I'll probably say to go out and try and do. Take your telephoto lens, set it to 100, 135, 200, and then have a go at that sort of shot, and you will be amazed at the tight-looking depth of field shots you can actually get. Now, one of the other things you can play around with as well, and I would definitely say it's worth getting one of these, is a nifty 50, because these are very cheap for most SLRs. This is the Canon 50mm f1.8. So what this gives you is a very massively wide aperture. You can probably just about see the hole there, see how huge it is. And this is a great lens for working in low light conditions, but it is also, as you can probably guess, great for producing shots that have very shallow depth of field. But you do have to be careful with something like the 51.8, the 85s, you know, the 135s, those sorts of lenses, because when you're working with, say, a 51.8, if somebody's about a metre away, your depth of field is going to be something like, I think it's about 4 centimetres, so it's just over an inch, so it's tiny. So if you're rocking backwards slightly as you're taking the photo, and your subject's rocking backwards and forwards as you're taking the photo, chances are, you know, you're not going to get their eyes shut, you're going to get the end of the nose shot, so you do have to be very careful. But these cameras, these lenses, with care, can produce some very startling results. But as you know, RoblinOnPhoto.com is all about making the most of the kit we've already got, and you'll probably find that by using a 55-250, or the telephoto zoom you've got, you'll be able to take some very, very nice portraits and that sort of photos, or flowers, or things like that. The only thing to watch out for, though, actually, which I will add on, is when you're shooting longer, especially if you're inside, because of the tighter aperture, your shutter speed is going to be longer. So make sure you're using your IS, or if the shutter speed starts getting too long and you're getting camera shake or subject movement, get your flash out. Either, you know, your pop-up flash, or start bouncing something off the ceiling, or use your off-camera flash. Do it that way, and that will really help. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go outside, and with the help of George. This is George. Just don't tell Suzanne I'm playing around with him, because if I drop him, I'm going to get into lots of trouble. But he's going to help us just play around with different subject to background distances, different focal lengths, different apertures, and different lenses to give you an idea of everything that goes on. So let's go outside and have a play. Okay, so I've set George up on the table, and what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to take a quick shot of George with the idea of getting George and the background in focus. So what I'm going to have to do is move slightly back from him, and then I'm going to use a tighter aperture. I reckon probably because the garden's not very big, something like f8, and then I'm going to take a picture that way, and then we'll see how we can get everything in focus. Okay, so what I found was that in order to get George in focus and the background as well, I went down to f16, which seemed to work very well. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to move in closer just to get like a head and shoulder shot, but I'm going to be doing it at 18mm on my 18 to 55, which is pretty wide. It's too wide for a portrait. Really, it's not very flattering. So because the idea then is just to show you how you can have the depth of field changes from like f3.5 to f8 to f16. So we'll do that one next, and you can sort of see the results. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move George even further away from the background, do 3 more shots at the 55mm end of my 18 to 55, just so you can see the difference in the background then as well. So, as you've probably seen from those shots, if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, like the 18 to 55 or something like that, if you want to nice out-of-focus portrait shots, your best bet is going to your 55mm. And then there's quite a bit of difference between shooting at like f5.6 and f16, but there isn't that much difference from shooting like from f5.6 to f8. So, you know, the critical thing there is to use a longer focal length and to crop the same, rather than think about getting too close, because if you get too close to the portraits, the features gets distorted. Now, for a really blown out background, what we're going to do now is something a little less counterintuitive. We're going to fit the big 55 to 250, and I'm going to zoom it out probably to something like 135 and take the same sorts of shots again with the same cropping at like f5.6, f8 and f16, and you'll really see the difference there and how the background blurs out. So let's have a go with that. Okay, so what you should have seen then from those shots, hopefully, is the fact that your trusty telephoto zoom, in this case the 55 to 250 or whatever you've got in your camera, is actually incredibly good at creating very shallow depth of field portraits that look beautiful, without having to buy any specialist lenses. So what we're going to do next is we're just going to plug on the 51.8 and do some similar shots just to see what we can do with that. So you can sort of kind of judge for yourself whether your portrait's using your existing telephoto kit, or whether it's worth spending maybe another £100 on something like a nifty 51.8. Let's have a look to see what it can do. So there we go. Hopefully what you've seen there is there's lots of different ways to play around with depth of field. If you want maximum depth of field, use your wide angle lens, set it to a small aperture, so big f-stop number, and focus about a third of the way into the scene, and you probably should get most of it in focus. If you want to play around with small apertures, by all means get something like 51.8, but don't spend hundreds of pounds on expensive lenses. Zoom out, zoom all the way out on your 18 to 55 or your kit lens, but better off, put your telephoto zoom on there, zoom out to 100mm, by all means set the aperture to f3.5, but you don't really need to, sorry, f5.6 in this case, you don't need to, you can go to f8 if the light allows, and you'll get that lovely out of focus background, which also, especially if you're in portrait, is very flattering, that longer focal length, and you haven't had to spend a fortune on some of the expensive glass with the fast apertures. So there we go. So have a play. If you want those short depth of field looks, don't forget your long telephoto and focus on closest things. My name's Rob from roblandphoto.com. I hope this video has been useful.